The courtroom was packed. Cameras flashed. Tension crackled like summer lightning over Georgia. Senator Olivia Bradford, a seasoned liberal lawmaker, was moments away from delivering what she called the final blow in a $5 million corruption case. But then she froze. Across the aisle stood someone no one expected, Karoline Leavitt, the young White House press secretary. No law degree, no courtroom experience, and yet with nothing more than a few legal documents and a calm voice, she unraveled everything. How did a spokesperson outsmart a powerful senator in federal court? Stay with us because this battle is just getting started. It was just past 9 a.m. when the courtroom doors swung open, and the energy inside the U.S. District Court in Atlanta shifted like a thunderclap. Reporters lined every inch of the wooden benches, some balancing cameras on their knees, others already typing on laptops, balanced over notepads. Microphones from CNN, Fox, and Newsmax hovered near the rail. The temperature outside was 82 degrees, but inside the room felt like it was on the brink of combustion. Federal security had to usher in the last few press members before closing the doors. No one wanted to miss this. This wasn't just another corruption trial. This was political theater at its finest, a high-stakes collision between Washington power and public money. And at the center of it all stood Senator Olivia Bradford, the senior Democratic lawmaker from Georgia known for her fiery speeches and crusades against corporate fraud. Bradford was already standing when Judge Arnold White entered the courtroom. She didn't wait for silence. Dressed in a sharp navy suit with a flag pin on her lapel, she turned and gave a brief nod to the reporters seated behind her, almost like a performer, acknowledging her audience before the curtain rose. Her legal team, 3 attorneys from the state's top ethics office, shuffled behind her, stacking folders nearly a foot high on the plaintiff's table. She didn't hesitate. The judge barely had time to greet the courtroom when Bradford stepped forward. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting clean across the room. "Today we bring forward undeniable proof of criminal misuse of federal environmental funds by Mr. Marshall Tate, CEO of Greenlight Corporation." Gasps rippled quietly through the room. Cameras clicked. Eyes darted to the man seated behind the defense table. Marshall Tate, late 50s, salt and pepper hair, dressed in a gray suit that looked like it had never seen a wrinkle. He sat still, expression unreadable, hands clasped. No defense attorney spoke. They let Bradford have the floor. She continued, holding up a flash drive no larger than a car key. "On this drive is a private conversation recorded inside Greenlight's headquarters. You will hear Mr. Tate himself admit in his own words to redirecting nearly $5 million of federal grants intended for clean water initiatives toward private construction projects in West Palm Beach, Florida." There was a rustle from the press row. One reporter gasped audibly. Another began whispering frantically into a phone. Bradford wasn't done. She reached into a black briefcase and pulled out a second folder, thick bound and stamped. "And if the audio isn't enough, we have bank statements, expense reports, and contracts, each one traced directly from Greenlight's federal accounts to Mr. Tate's private ventures. These aren't allegations, Your Honor. They're facts." She approached the bench with steady steps and placed the drive and documents on the clerk's desk. The courtroom was silent, but the pressure in the air was immense, like a spring pulled too tight. Judge White, a firm man in his early 70s with a long history of presiding over white-collar cases, didn't blink. He leaned forward slightly, hands folded. "Senator Bradford, are you presenting this as a formal motion?" "I am," she replied quickly. "Motion to admit key evidence in the prosecution of Greenlight Corporation and its CEO, Marshall Tate, under federal anti-corruption statutes." The judge nodded slowly. "And are all items on this list submitted with full procedural compliance?" Bradford nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Every document was obtained with proper court authorization. Every byte of this recording was vetted." "We're ready to proceed." Her tone was unwavering. It was the voice of someone who had already decided the trial was over, someone who believed the victory had been secured in the preparation room weeks ago. From where the press sat, Olivia Bradford looked like a prosecutor in full command of the battlefield. In the back row, a woman in her 70s leaned over and whispered to her husband, "She's going to crush them." But something shifted just slightly when Bradford returned to her seat. The opposing table hadn't moved. Tate remained stoic. His legal team didn't shuffle, didn't whisper, didn't even react. And seated at the edge of the defense bench, crossing one leg over the other, was someone the press hadn't expected to see. Karoline Leavitt, the former Trump White House press secretary. She was younger than everyone else in the room, mid to late 20s, no visible legal credentials, no law firm affiliation. And yet she sat there calm as stone, watching Bradford with a kind of quiet scrutiny that made even veteran attorneys uncomfortable. Her presence was strange, unexplained. Why was a former press secretary involved in a federal corruption trial? Bradford seemed to notice her for the first time, her eyes narrowing briefly. Leavitt didn't blink. She simply glanced at the flash drive on the table, then looked up at the judge. The opening phase had ended. Evidence had been presented. The crowd thought the battle was over before it began. But as Senator Olivia Bradford smiled faintly, settling into her chair, she had no idea what was coming next. Across the courtroom, Karoline Leavitt slowly straightened her spine and picked up a slim folder of her own. She hadn't spoken a word yet, but what she said next would turn the entire courtroom upside down. The moment hung in the air, still and tight. Senator Olivia Bradford had just returned to her seat, her case neatly laid out, her voice still echoing faintly in the chamber. It was the kind of moment when most defense teams fumble for damage control, stalling, objecting, grasping for time. But instead of rising, Tate's lawyers stayed seated. They looked calm. Too calm. Then Karoline Leavitt stood. No rustle of papers. No signal from Tate's legal team. Just the quiet, deliberate motion of one woman rising in the heart of a federal courtroom. Petite, blonde, and poised in a tailored black suit, she stepped forward like someone used to being underestimated and perfectly fine with it. "Your Honor," she said clearly, her tone crisp but polite. "I'm Karoline Leavitt, special legal advisor to the defense, appointed at the request of the administration." The room stirred. A murmur rolled through the back benches. Karoline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, the face of the Trump administration's media machine. What was she doing here? She wasn't an attorney, at least not by degree. She wasn't even listed on the pre-trial documents. But now there she was, speaking calmly to a federal judge as if she'd done it for years. Judge Arnold White raised an eyebrow but didn't stop her. He'd seen enough high-profile trials to know when something interesting was about to happen. Leavitt continued, lifting a slim file in her left hand. "Before the court proceeds to consider the motion submitted by Senator Bradford, I respectfully request a review of the legality of the evidence, specifically the audio recording presented just moments ago." Senator Bradford turned, arching one brow and flashing a half-smile laced with contempt. She leaned slightly toward her microphone. "Your Honor," she said dryly, "I'd like the record to show we're now taking legal advice from a press secretary." There were a few chuckles in the gallery. One reporter typed the phrase "Trump's PR Barbie" into a live blog. The jab was clear, calculated, dismissive. But Leavitt didn't blink. She looked straight at Bradford. "Ma'am," she replied, her voice calm as still water. "You can call me a Barbie or a bulldog, but I'd suggest you review Georgia's recording consent laws before you bet the case on that audio." That wiped the smirk off Bradford's face. Leavitt turned back to the bench, her posture straight, her words sharper now. "Under Georgia Code, Payroll 16-1162, all parties must consent to the recording of a private conversation unless a court order has been issued in advance. According to the documents presented by Senator Bradford, there is no such order on record." Judge White leaned back, fingers steepled. "Are you alleging the recording is inadmissible?" "Yes, Your Honor," Leavitt replied. "Illegally obtained evidence, no matter how damning, has no place in a federal courtroom. I respectfully move to exclude the audio on the grounds of unlawful interception." Another wave of murmurs swept the courtroom. Reporters scrambled to revise headlines. Bradford, visibly annoyed, shot back. "This recording was obtained by a whistleblower inside Greenlight Corp. during an internal discussion about public funding misuse. That's protected speech." Leavitt shook her head, expression steady. "The Whistleblower Protection Act, Title 5. U.S. Code, ASR 2302, shields individuals from retaliation. It does not legalize unauthorized recordings. Protection from being fired isn't the same as permission to break wiretap laws." Even the court clerk stopped writing for a moment. Bradford's jaw tightened. "So now the White House thinks it can interpret Georgia law." Leavitt remained still. "I'm not interpreting anything, Senator. I'm quoting it." For a moment, no one moved. Judge White looked from one woman to the other, weighing the tension. Then he cleared his throat. "Miss Leavitt, do you have documentation supporting your claim?" "I do, Your Honor," she said, passing a printed copy of the state statute to the clerk, along with 3 precedent cases from the 11th Circuit Court, invalidating similar recordings in civil proceedings. Bradford glanced at her attorneys, who began flipping through folders in a mild panic. One of them whispered something. The other paled slightly. From the back of the courtroom, the dynamic had flipped. 10 minutes ago, Bradford looked untouchable. Now her posture was stiff, her tone brittle. Leavitt hadn't raised her voice once, but she had seized the room like a trial veteran. No theatrics, just precision. A journalist in the press gallery leaned over to her colleague and whispered, "She's not just some media puppet." And the truth was settling in. Karoline Leavitt wasn't here for show. She was here with a strategy, a playbook. And perhaps most unnerving for Bradford, the law was on her side. Judge White tapped his gavel lightly. "Motion to exclude the audio will be considered after reviewing the precedents. Miss Leavitt, please remain available for further questioning." "Of course, Your Honor," Leavitt said, stepping back to her seat. Bradford watched her the entire time. Her hand rested on the folder of evidence that now suddenly felt a lot less solid. And across the room, Leavitt sat down with quiet confidence, glancing only briefly at Marshall Tate, who gave her the slightest nod. The senator leaned toward her co-counsel. "This was supposed to be open and shut," she whispered. "Why is she here?" Her counsel shook his head. "We don't know, but she's good. Too good." The gallery whispered. The press typed faster. Headlines changed mid-sentence. What began as a simple trial against a suspected corrupt CEO had shifted into something more. The courtroom wasn't watching a senator deliver justice anymore. They were watching Karoline Leavitt dismantle it, one law at a time. And the battle was far from over. Judge Arnold White hadn't moved an inch. His posture remained upright, but his expression had shifted. The words, "illegally obtained evidence," still hovered in the room like a thick cloud. What was supposed to be a straightforward case had twisted unexpectedly into uncharted territory. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't finished. She stood again calmly, as if the entire courtroom was just a quiet Sunday briefing in the White House press room. She didn't look to the audience or even to Marshall Tate. Her eyes were locked on Senator Olivia Bradford, and her voice came clear and firm. "Your Honor," Leavitt said, lifting the slim folder again, "if I may. I would also like to challenge the second piece of evidence just introduced, the financial records Senator Bradford submitted into the court." The shift was immediate. The courtroom had just started recovering from the blow about the audio recording. Now jaws tightened again. Chairs creaked. Reporters froze mid-keystroke. Bradford leaned forward, glaring. "What now?" she snapped. Leavitt didn't flinch. "Those financial records," she said, "were collected under a subpoena. that is unfortunately, procedurally, invalid. Gasps again. Quieter this time, but filled with disbelief. Judge White motioned for her to continue. The subpoena included in the filings, Leavitt said as she handed a highlighted copy to the court clerk, was signed, not by a judge, but by a court clerk, specifically Clerk Paula Nguyen, whose signature appears right here, time-stamped last Thursday at 2:47 p.m. She paused just long enough to let the silence build, then continued. Under Rule 45 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, only a judge has the authority to issue subpoenas for private financial records in a case of this nature. A clerk's signature without judicial oversight is legally insufficient. Olivia Bradford stood abruptly. "That's ridiculous," she barked. "It was a rush case. We had to move fast to freeze those records." Leavitt stayed composed. "Fast doesn't mean sloppy, Senator," she said flatly. "And certainly not when you're accusing someone of federal crimes in front of a national audience." Judge White tapped his gavel once, a sharp pop that snapped the tension. "Senator Bradford," he said, turning toward her with the authority only decades on the bench could provide, "did you knowingly submit a subpoena without a judicial signature?" Bradford hesitated. Her legal team flipped through folders frantically. Her co-counsel whispered something into her ear, and for the first time that morning her face lost color. I believe it was signed under emergency circumstances," she said carefully. "The clerk was authorized." "She was not," Leavitt interjected. "Clerks can process subpoenas. They cannot authorize them in federal corruption trials involving private financial institutions. That is black-letter law." Judge White nodded slowly, absorbing each word. "Miss Leavitt," he said, "you're saying the evidence from the financial documents must also be excluded?" "Yes, Your Honor. I respectfully move to suppress the financial records on the basis of improper subpoena authorization." Bradford threw her hands up in frustration. "This is a technicality," she exclaimed. "We have the truth. The paper trail is there. Millions were stolen." Leavitt finally turned her eyes toward her opponent, and for the first time there was an edge to her voice. "And yet," she said, "you walked into this courtroom claiming the moral high ground, armed with an illegal recording and an invalid subpoena. The law isn't about feelings. It's about process. And if the process is broken, the evidence doesn't stand." That hit hard. Even some of the press, many of whom had come expecting to watch Bradford deliver a career-defining takedown, were now scribbling furiously, rewriting angles, reframing the story in real time. Judge White adjusted his glasses. "Senator, your office filed these documents without judicial authorization." Bradford's voice wavered. "It was an internal misstep," she admitted, "but it shouldn't overshadow the fact that Mr. Tate embezzled public money." Judge White didn't even look at her. His eyes were still on the subpoena. "We're not here to determine guilt by suspicion," he said. "We're here to evaluate facts and the admissibility of evidence. If this subpoena is invalid, then so is everything it uncovered." Leavitt gently sat down again, crossing one leg over the other. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply picked up a pen and began reviewing her notes as if it were all routine. For her, maybe it was. At the plaintiff's table, Bradford had gone still. The documents she had once waved confidently were now sitting limp before her. Her voice, so firm just 15 minutes ago, had faded into a brittle whisper. Her opponent wasn't a licensed attorney. But Karoline Leavitt had just outmaneuvered her with the law itself. In the gallery, the mood had shifted. The buzz was no longer about Greenlight Corp. Or the Environmental Fund. It was about a woman with no law degree, standing toe-to-toe with a sitting senator and winning. One older gentleman near the back leaned toward his wife and whispered, "That girl just turned the whole case inside out." His wife nodded, and she didn't even raise her voice. Judge White looked at both tables, then glanced at the clock. It was nearing 10:40 a.m., but the weight of the morning made it feel like a full day had passed. "This court will recess for 15 minutes, he said finally. "During that time, I will review the legality of both the audio and the financial documents. Be prepared to proceed based on my ruling." He banged the gavel and the courtroom erupted not in noise but in tension. Reporters jumped to their feet. Some rushed toward the hallway. Others made calls. Bradford remained seated, her hand covering her mouth. Her co-counsel leaned in with suggestions, but she wasn't listening. Her eyes were locked on the slim folder across the room. And Leavitt. She stood calmly, tucked her papers into her briefcase, and nodded once to Marshall Tate. Then she stepped into the hallway without a word, leaving behind a room full of disbelief, admiration, and rising suspense. Whatever people thought of her politics, one truth was now impossible to ignore. Karoline Leavitt had just turned the trial upside down, and she was only getting started. The gavel struck, but the silence that followed felt louder than any bang of wood could command. Judge Arnold White had just recessed court for 15 minutes to review the legality of two key pieces of evidence. But everyone in that courtroom already sensed the shift. Senator Olivia Bradford sat still, fists clenched, lips pressed into a thin line. Her ironclad case, the one she had proudly carried into court just an hour earlier, was falling apart, not under the weight of politics or emotion, but under the scalpel of precise legal procedure. And the person wielding that scalpel, Karoline Leavitt. She stood once more before anyone else could regain their footing. The recess hadn't even begun to clear the room. No dramatics, no raised voice. Just calm, relentless momentum. "Your Honor," she said, as reporters still rustled in their seats. "Before the court takes recess, I request one additional point of clarification regarding the subpoena submitted by Senator Bradford." Judge White, who had begun removing his glasses, paused mid-motion. "Proceed." Leavitt stepped forward, lifting the subpoena between her fingers for all to see. The subpoena for Mr. Tate's financial records, Exhibit C, bears the signature of Court Clerk Paula Nguyen. She walked toward the judge's bench as she spoke, slow and clear. "Not a federal judge. Not a magistrate. A clerk." Bradford shot up. "That subpoena was processed in accordance with court protocol," she shouted, voice rising, finger jabbing the air. Leavitt turned only slightly, eyes still forward. "Processed, maybe," she replied coolly, "but not authorized." Then she laid it out. Clean, sharp, lethal. Under Rule 45 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, subpoenas compelling the release of financial documents must bear the signature of a federal judge to be valid in federal court. No exceptions. A clerk's signature may suffice for administrative records, but not for private bank transactions in a high-profile criminal case. She laid the subpoena on the clerk's desk and stepped back without a word. Bradford's voice broke into the silence again, shaky, strained. "This is a technicality. She's playing games. This is about justice, not paperwork." But Judge White was already shaking his head. "Senator," he said sternly, "Rule 45 is clear. Miss Leavitt is well within her right to challenge the legitimacy of this document." Bradford's face flushed red. Her hand slammed the table. "Who is she to tell me about the law?" she barked. "She's not even a lawyer." Gasps echoed. Even some members of her own team looked stunned. Leavitt didn't raise her voice. She didn't blink. "I don't need a law degree," she said, voice low and even. "You exposed the flaw yourself." She looked right at Bradford now, eyes steady as glass. "You came into this courtroom hoping passion would cover for procedure. You assumed no one would notice a missing judge's signature. But the law doesn't care how loud you are or how long you've served in Congress. It only cares whether the process is right." The silence that followed was deafening. From the back row, a reporter whispered into her mic, "Bradford's unraveling." Leavitt just gutted the subpoena with a single sentence. Judge White cleared his throat and addressed the clerk. "Confirm the signature. Is this indeed Clerk Nguyen's?" The court clerk nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. The file shows it was processed late Thursday by Clerk Paula Nguyen. There is no corresponding judge's order attached." White leaned back, the weight of the revelations settling over the courtroom. "Then until a valid subpoena is produced, the financial records in question are inadmissible," he said. Bradford exploded. "You're letting a press secretary Trump's mouthpiece dictate federal procedure. This is absurd." Leavitt turned toward her again with surgical calm. "If following the law is absurd, then you're in the wrong courtroom." That was the final break. Bradford stood behind her desk, shoulders stiff, hands shaking slightly. Her voice cracked now, more anger than control. "You think you've won because you found a clerical error. You think the truth disappears because of one missing signature." Leavitt's reply was quiet, but hit like a bullet. "No," she said. "But in federal court, truth only matters when it's delivered legally." The judge banged his gavel once. "Enough." Bradford didn't move. Her jaw was tight, her breath short. But the damage was done. Her opening arguments, built on that recording, and the financial trail, had just collapsed under the weight of their own process. Leavitt didn't gloat. She simply returned to her seat, folded her hands, and waited. The press gallery came alive. Reporters rushed to the hallway calling editors. "Leavitt destroys subpoena in corruption trial," one typed. Another whispered, "She just outlawyered a senator with no license." And across the courtroom, Marshall Tate, the man accused of stealing $5 million in federal funds, looked at Leavitt with something between shock and respect. Not a word had come from him all morning. He didn't need to speak. His legal strategy wasn't built on rebuttal. It was built on Karoline Leavitt finding cracks no one else saw. As the courtroom emptied for recess, Bradford sat down heavily, staring at the folder in front of her. Her top aide, Gloria Benson, leaned over and whispered, "We can try to pivot. Maybe find new witnesses." But Bradford didn't answer. Her case hadn't just been challenged. It had been disassembled quietly, precisely, and publicly. And the one who had done it, a 27-year-old woman who once stood behind podiums, now standing center stage in a federal courtroom, rewriting the rules as she went. 15 minutes passed, but to those inside the courtroom, it felt like a full hour. When Judge Arnold White re-entered and took his seat, the air was thick with expectation. Olivia Bradford sat tense, her hands folded tightly on the table, her shoulders no longer squared with confidence. Her team looked shaken. Her case, once ironclad, had lost its two central pillars thanks to a quiet but relentless opponent. Karoline Leavitt stood as the judge adjusted his glasses. But instead of waiting for a prompt, she spoke clearly, confidently, and with finality. "Your Honor," she said, holding up a single sheet of paper. "Before you rule, I ask to enter one final motion. A motion not just rooted in process, but in Supreme Court precedent." Judge White motioned for her to proceed. She stepped forward with the composure of someone who'd done this 100 times, though everyone in the room knew she hadn't. In the case of United States versus Nixon, 418 U.S. 683, 1974, the Supreme Court ruled that even presidential privilege does not excuse the unlawful withholding or mishandling of evidence. But more importantly for this courtroom today, it also made one thing crystal clear. No piece of evidence, no matter how significant, can be admitted if it was obtained illegally. She paused just long enough for the courtroom to digest the weight of that statement. Then in one fluid motion, she set the precedent copy on the clerk's desk and turned back to face the bench. Both the audio recording and the financial documents were obtained in violation of federal law. One without the required consent, the other without a judge's authorization. That's not a minor oversight. That's a direct breach of constitutional protection. Bradford's chair squeaked as she leaned forward, her face pale. Leavitt continued, her tone measured but firm. This trial has attracted national attention, but it should not become a stage where rules are bent for spectacle. I respectfully move that all submitted evidence by the plaintiff be excluded, and that the trial be suspended until legally admissible material is presented. A murmur moved through the crowd like a ripple through still water. Some reporters froze mid-typing. Others leaned in, eyes wide. Senator Bradford couldn't hold back. "Your Honor," she said, voice trembling with frustration. "This is a calculated attempt to bury the truth. She's twisting a 50-year-old case to protect a corrupt man." Leavitt didn't flinch. "I'm protecting the law. The same law that applies to presidents and senators alike. Nixon couldn't avoid the rules. Neither can we." Judge White leaned forward, fingers folded under his chin. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask for clarification. He simply watched Leavitt, the way a surgeon watches a final stitch, evaluating precision, intent, and control. And in that silence, something extraordinary happened. Olivia Bradford, the senior senator from Georgia, former prosecutor, political heavyweight, had no rebuttal left. Her arguments had been methodically dismantled, her evidence disqualified, and now even her passion was being met with precedent that could not be ignored. The courtroom had stopped being hers. It belonged, at least for now, to Karoline Leavitt. Judge White finally spoke, and the tone in his voice was different. Not cold, not hostile, but resolved. "I have reviewed the facts, the motions, and the legal precedent entered into the record," he said. "This court agrees with the defense that both the audio recording and the subpoenaed financial documents fail to meet the standards of admissible evidence under federal law." He turned to the clerk, then back to both tables. "The motion to exclude both pieces of evidence is granted." The words landed like thunder. "You will not yell in my courtroom," Senator Judge White said sharply, turning toward her. "You've had every chance to follow correct procedure. You didn't. This isn't about protecting the accused. It's about upholding the Constitution." He reached for his gavel, then hesitated just long enough to make the weight of his next words hang in the room. "This court is not dismissing the case," he said, "but the trial is hereby suspended indefinitely until admissible evidence is presented. All prior submissions are stricken from the record." Bang! The gavel came down. And just like that, Olivia Bradford's case collapsed. Bradford didn't stand. She didn't speak. Her mouth was set in a hard line, her eyes fixed, not on the judge, but on Karoline Leavitt, the woman she had mocked. The press secretary she'd written off as a political pawn, the non-lawyer who had just delivered the most devastating legal blow of her career. Across the room, Leavitt collected her notes without hurry. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply turned and nodded at Marshall Tate, who for the first time all day allowed a faint sigh of relief to escape. Reporters exploded into motion. Headlines formed on laptops before the courtroom cleared. "Senator crumbles in court as Trump spokeswoman cites Nixon precedent." Karoline Leavitt outmaneuvers career politician in stunning legal showdown. Bradford finally stood, shoulders heavy, the fire in her expression now replaced by disbelief. Her aide, Gloria Benson, leaned in quietly. "We didn't see her coming," she said. "No," Bradford whispered back. "And we may never catch up." Outside, the hallway filled with flashes from cameras and bursts of questions. But Leavitt didn't stop for the press. She walked straight through, silent and sharp, like a woman who had just finished what she came to do and was already thinking 3 steps ahead. For the courtroom, the trial was over. But for Karoline Leavitt, this was only the beginning. The marble hallway outside the federal courthouse buzzed with reporters, flashing cameras, and shouted questions. Karoline Leavitt didn't stop for any of it. She stepped through the noise like it was weather, unbothered, unwavering, unreadable. Behind her, the courtroom doors had closed on one of the most shocking legal reversals in recent memory. But the real moment was still ahead. Senator Olivia Bradford followed several paces behind. Her blazer was still buttoned, but the fire in her eyes had shifted. The outrage had quieted. Now it was calculation, reflection, a bruised ego wrapped in resolve. She caught up just as Leavitt reached a quiet corner by the stone columns. Miss Leavitt Bradford said, her voice low but unmistakably clear. Karoline stopped, slowly turned and faced her former opponent without a flicker of surprise. Bradford stared at her for a long second. The woman she'd mocked as Trump's press girl had just turned the courtroom upside down with nothing but logic, case law, and composure. No theatrics, no legal credentials, just raw precision. "You're not a lawyer," Bradford said at last, "but you just humiliated me in front of the entire country." There was no anger in her voice now, just the kind of honesty that only comes after a public loss. Leavitt didn't gloat. She didn't break eye contact. She simply replied quietly and calmly, "I'm not here to be liked, Senator. I'm here to win." Bradford's lips curved slightly, not a smile, but something close. "Well, congratulations," she said. "Today you did just that. But don't get too comfortable." She leaned in slightly. "I'll be back. And next time I won't underestimate you." Leavitt gave the faintest nod. "I look forward to it." And in that small moment between two women from opposite ends of the political spectrum, something passed that went deeper than rivalry. It was respect, hard-earned, reluctant, but real. As Bradford turned and walked toward her staff, the press swarmed. Cameras flashed. Questions flew. "Senator Bradford, do you have a comment on today's courtroom loss? Miss Leavitt did the White House coach you for this trial? Will you be practicing law next?" Neither answered. But inside newsrooms across the country, the headlines wrote themselves. "Spokeswoman stuns courtroom. Senator outmaneuvered in legal showdown. Trump's press secretary delivers devastating legal blow without law degree. From podium to power move. Karoline Leavitt shifts the game." The coverage wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about the collision between generations, ideologies, and approaches to power. A seasoned lawmaker brought emotion, experience, and exposure, but a sharp young voice brought precision, precedent, and composure and came out ahead. Back inside the courthouse, Bradford's aide, Gloria Benson, walked quietly beside her. Reporters trailed at a distance. "She's dangerous," Gloria said softly. "If she's not a lawyer now, she'll become one. You can feel it." Bradford didn't answer right away. She looked straight ahead, her jaw tight. "She's more than dangerous," the senator finally muttered. "She's prepared, and next time she'll be even sharper." They exited to the parking circle where flashing lights and microphones awaited. Meanwhile, Leavitt had already slipped past the chaos and into a waiting vehicle. The driver pulled away as reporters jogged behind, snapping final photos through the window. She didn't look back. Inside the car, Leavitt checked her phone. A message from the White House read, "Outstanding work. Call when free." POTUS impressed. She locked the screen and stared out the window. Not smiling, just thinking. This hadn't been about media control or politics. This was about setting a precedent not just in court, but in the public imagination. That a press secretary could walk into a federal courtroom and bring down a sitting senator's case with pure legal discipline. It wasn't just unexpected. It was historic. And yet Karoline Leavitt wasn't celebrating. She was planning, because she knew this wasn't the end. It was only round one. Epilogue. Opening the next chapter. Inside her office that evening, Olivia Bradford sat at her desk flipping through her legal binder, now stripped of its once airtight evidence. Gloria stood nearby sipping coffee in silence. Bradford didn't look up. "Next time I come with firepower," she muttered. "Not just documents. Real groundwork." Gloria nodded slowly. And what about her? Bradford paused, then said plainly, we track her. Study her. Because next time I'm not walking into her courtroom. Across D.C., Leavitt stepped onto the White House press podium, answering a question about the economy, before smiling faintly at a reporter who asked about the trial. I just followed the law, she said, and reminded the court that no one is above it, not even someone with a title. The room fell silent. The message was unmistakable. This wasn't just a win. It was a warning, and America was watching. In today's fast-moving world, it's easy to assume that titles, age, or years of experience determine who holds the truth. But this powerful courtroom story reminds us that preparation, clarity, and calm under pressure still win the day. Karoline Leavitt didn't rely on reputation, she relied on facts, the law, and composure. It's a lesson we can all take to heart. No matter your background, never underestimate someone's ability to rise when it matters most, and never let pride keep you from double-checking the details. In life, as in court, it's not always the loudest voice that wins. It's the one with reason, respect, and resolve. If this story moved you or reminded you of a moment in your life, drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe for more gripping real-life lessons and dramatic showdowns that speak to the heart.